Something ancient stirred beneath the universe long before the Avengers ever assembled, long before gods fell from the sky or men learned to bend time, something that did not conquer with armies or destroy with explosions, but whispered instead, feeding on a force even stronger than power itself, fear. And on a night when the stars over Earth flickered like nervous eyes, that thing finally noticed the Marvel Universe watching back. It began quietly, the way true disasters always do, not with screams, but with unease. Children in New York waking from the same dream, clutching their chests, unable to breathe, describing a laughing sound echoing from storm drains that did not exist on their streets, parents dismissing it as imagination until adults, too, started waking with sweat-soaked sheets and a single thought looping in their minds. Something is wrong. Dr. Strange felt it first, not as pain, but as distortion. The sanctum sanctorum's wards shuddering like glass under pressure, spells older than civilizations unraveling at the edges, as if reality itself had developed a phobia. And when Strange opened the eye of Agamotto seeking clarity, he saw instead a spiral of red and white, a grin that stretched wider than logic, and a presence so vast it made Dormammu feel like a shadow pretending to be a monster. Miles away beneath the streets, sewer water rippled without cause as a shape unfolded itself from nothing, tall, hunched, wearing a face stitched together from mockery, eyes glowing with intelligent hunger. Pennywise, the dancing clown, inhaled deeply, as if tasting the air, and laughed softly because this universe was rich, overflowing with fear, disguised as courage, fear of failure, fear of loss, fear of becoming what one hates, and most delicious of all, fear hidden behind godhood. The first disappearance was small enough to ignore, a child in Queens vanishing near a subway entrance, then another in Brooklyn, then a homeless man found frozen in terror, with a smile carved into his face that no human hand could replicate. S.H.I.E.L.D. flagged it as unrelated incidents until the reports reached Natasha Romanoff's desk, and even she felt the chill of pattern forming where chaos should have lived. Spider-Man encountered it by accident, chasing a low-level arms dealer into a tunnel that should have dead-ended, but instead stretched endlessly, the walls breathing softly, the darkness thickening, until his spider sense screamed in agony. And then the voice came playful and knowing, calling him by his real name, reminding him of Uncle Ben, of Gwen, of every moment he failed to save someone. And when Peter fired a web, it vanished into nothing, as laughter echoed from everywhere and nowhere at once. Pennywise did not kill him, not yet, because fear ripens best when allowed to grow, when hope is dangled just out of reach, and Spider-Man escaped, shaking and silent, carrying a terror he could not explain to the Avengers without sounding insane, which pleased the creature immensely. Across the world, Bruce Banner felt Hulk stirring restlessly, not with anger, but confusion. Hulk muttering about a clown in the dark, about being small and scared again, something Banner had buried beneath years of control and suppression. Pennywise tasting the fractured psyche and smiling wider. Gods break so beautifully when reminded they are still children inside. Thor dreamed of Asgard drowned in red balloons floating above corpses, Odin's ravens pecking at his eyes while a painted face applauded, and when Thor awoke gripping Stormbreaker, he realized with dread that fear had followed him into consciousness. something that should not be possible. Doctor Strange convened the Avengers, but the room felt wrong. Shadows leaning closer than they should, lights flickering in mockery, and when he spoke the name Pennywise aloud, the temperature dropped, ancient text bleeding ink as if recoiling from the word, because this was no demon, no alien, no cosmic tyrant. This was an eater, a predator, older than stars that did not invade worlds. It waited for them to rot from the inside. Above Earth, unseen by all, Pennywise watched the heroes gather, savoring their tension, their denial, their desperate need to categorize the unclassifiable. And for the first time in centuries, the creature felt something close to excitement, because this universe would not fall quickly. It would scream, struggle, and taste exquisite before it broke. And the real game had finally begun. Dot, an unspoken dread crept through the Avengers Tower long before anyone admitted it aloud. The kind of fear that does not scream, but settles quietly behind the eyes, altering thoughts, bending logic, making even gods hesitate, because whatever Doctor Strange had sensed was no longer distant. It was here, watching, learning, choosing. The first to crack was not who anyone expected. It was not the soldier or the spy or the man with too much rage. It was Vision, the being born of logic and light, who began experiencing something dangerously close to dreams, flashes of a childhood he never lived. A mother calling from a hallway that stretched impossibly long, a clown-shaped shadow hovering at the edge of perception. And every time Vision attempted to analyze it, the data collapsed into static, as if fear itself rejected calculation. Wanda Maximoff noticed before anyone else, she always did, sensing the emotional dissonance radiating from Vision like a silent scream. And when she reached into his mind to soothe him, she recoiled violently, collapsing to her knees as a voice laughed inside her skull, not mocking, not cruel, but delighted, calling her little witch, reminding her of Sokovia, of parents buried under rubble, of nights she prayed for death to come faster. And Pennywise learned in that moment that chaos magic tasted exquisite. Natasha began pulling intelligence threads worldwide, and what emerged was not a pattern of attack, but a pattern of fear escalation. Nightmares reported across continents, adults refusing to sleep, hospitals overwhelmed with patients experiencing heart failure without physical cause, entire neighborhoods gripped by mass hysteria, and always the same symbols recurring: balloons, drains, laughter echoing where no mouth should be. Bruce Banner locked himself in a lab when Hulk refused to come out, not in fear of damage, but fear of being seen. Hulk curling inward like a child whispering about a man with sharp hands who promised it would hurt less if he stopped fighting, and Banner realized with horror that this enemy did not provoke rage, it consumed it, starving the Hulk by reminding him of his weakest moments. Doctor Strange attempted containment spells, dream wards, reality anchors, but each incantation felt like trying to cage smoke with bare hands. Pennywise slipping between dimensions with ease, appearing in reflections, in half-remembered thoughts, in the silence between heartbeats, and the more Strange pushed, the more the entity responded with amusement, warping the mirror dimension into a carnival of broken geometry and blood-stained colors before politely stepping back into reality untouched. Spider-Man finally spoke up during a briefing, his voice shaking despite every joke he forced out, describing the tunnel, the voice, the way it knew things no enemy should know, And the room fell silent, not because they doubted him, but because each of them recognized something uncomfortably similar in their own minds. Something personal, something targeted. Pennywise did not attack the Avengers directly. Instead, it struck where heroes could not respond fast enough. Small towns, forgotten streets, places without symbols in the sky to offer hope, feeding carefully, slowly, letting survivors spread stories laced with disbelief and terror, because fear multiplied best when shared, when dismissed, when allowed to fester. Thor sought counsel from the stars, traveling to Nidavellir, seeking answers older than Midgard, only to find the forges cold and the dwarves barricaded in silence, eyes wide with terror, whispering of a clown that spoke in riddles and showed them futures where even gods screamed. And Thor returned with Stormbreaker, heavy in his grip, and something heavier in his chest. Doubt. Nick Fury activated protocols buried so deep they had no names. But even his secrets felt exposed, memories of lost eyes and lost friends resurfacing uninvited. And Fury realized this was not a war of weapons or tactics. This was an infection, and every hero was already compromised. Pennywise watched it all unfold with patient glee, expanding roots into the collective unconscious, adapting, learning the rhythms of this universe, discovering that superheroes tasted better than ordinary prey because their fear was layered with responsibility, guilt, and the unbearable knowledge that failure meant world's ending. In the shadows of the sanctum, Dr. Strange finally spoke the truth none of them wanted to hear, that Pennywise could not be fought like a villain, could not be killed by strength or strategy alone, because it was not invading their world, it was feeding on it. And unless they learned how fear truly worked, unless they confronted what they hid from themselves, the Marvel Universe would not fall in battle. It would collapse in its sleep. Above them all unseen, Pennywise smiled wider than ever, because denial had cracked, fear had taken root, and the feast had only just begun. Inevitability arrived disguised as sleep, because no matter how powerful a hero was, exhaustion was still human. And when the Avengers finally collapsed into fractured rest, Pennywise seized the moment with surgical precision, stitching their dreams together into a single shared nightmare where escape felt possible until it wasn't. They awoke standing in Avengers Tower, yet the windows showed nothing but darkness outside, the city gone, the sky pulsing like a living wound. And the silence was wrong, heavy, expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath, Strange immediately recognizing the dream space, but failing to locate its edges, which was impossible, because every constructed dream had rules, and this one did not. The elevator chimed behind them, and doors slid open to reveal a long corridor that should not exist, stretching endlessly, lined with doors bearing their names. And before anyone could stop him, Tony Stark laughed nervously and reached for his, joking that he'd hacked worse nightmares before, the door opening onto a workshop filled with half-built armors hanging like corpses, each one replaying a different failure: Sokovia, Ultron, shattered cities, dead civilians, and in the center, a small boy with Morgan's face looking up at him, asking why he wasn't there. Tony staggered back, gasping, the suit refusing to deploy, tech dissolving into rust as Pennywise's voice echoed softly from the ceiling, telling him intelligence meant nothing when fear rewrote the rules. And Tony realized with rising horror that he could not invent his way out of guilt. Across the hall, Natasha opened her door to a snow-covered training yard. Young girls fighting until one stopped moving, instructors applauding, and the red ledger bleeding names onto the ice. Pennywise standing beside her, applauding politely, thanking her for teaching him how fear could be sharpened into obedience. And Natasha felt something inside her crack, not because of pain, but recognition. Thor's door revealed Asgard reborn only to rot instantly, warriors dropping their weapons, gods kneeling before a grinning clown crowned with Odin's helm, Thor swinging Stormbreaker only for it to pass through the illusion like mist, as Pennywise asked him quietly what a god was worth if he could not protect those who believed in him. Bruce never opened his door because it opened itself, revealing a mirror where Banner stood small and trembling while Hulk loomed behind him, shrinking with every breath. Pennywise crouched between them, whispering that monsters were only brave until they remembered they were made. And Hulk screamed in terror, fading into nothing. Wanda's door did not open to a room, but to a memory. Sokovia mid-collapse, rubble crushing her parents again and again, Vision dying repeatedly in her arms, Pennywise changing faces, each time smiling sympathetically, telling her grief was a door she never locked, and that he was grateful for the invitation. Strange tried to pull them out, forcing his will through the dream, but the environment resisted like a living organism. Pennywise stepping into view at last, fully formed, bowing theatrically as if greeting old friends, explaining without malice that this was not an attack but a demonstration that fear unified universes more effectively than conquest ever could. The mistake happened when Tony refused to look away, when instead of retreating, he charged Pennywise, driven by anger, by defiance, by the desperate need to prove something still obeyed him. And in that moment, Pennywise showed him the future, Earth silent, Avengers statues cracked and forgotten. And Tony understood not because it was inevitable, but because it was possible. And possibility was enough to break him. The dream shattered violently, throwing them awake across the tower, gasping for air, alarms blaring, Wanda screaming, Bruce sobbing, Thor silent and pale, and Tony Stark sitting rigid, staring at nothing, his hands shaking uncontrollably because Pennywise had not killed him, it had hollowed him out. Dr. Strange realized too late what had happened, that Pennywise didn't need bodies, it needed belief, and it had just convinced one of Earth's greatest defenders that fear was unbeatable. And as Pennywise's laughter echoed faintly through reality itself, Strange understood with dread that the entity had crossed the first threshold. A hero's mind had fallen, and the rules of the war had changed forever. Disorientation clung to reality long after the dream, because the Avengers Tower no longer felt like a sanctuary, but a fragile structure balanced on the edge of collapse. And Tony Stark's silence was louder than any alarm, a hollow stillness that unsettled even those who had faced gods and monsters without flinching. Tony locked himself away within hours, sealing the upper floors with protocols even Friday hesitated to override, his mind replaying visions Pennywise had planted not as prophecy, but as temptation, futures where preparation failed, where hope was a liability, and where fear was not conquered, but managed through absolute control. Dr. Strange confronted him but found only half-built ideas spiraling into obsession, algorithms designed to monitor psychological states, global fear indices, neural dampeners disguised as safety measures. Tony insisting that if fear was the enemy, then fear itself had to be regulated, contained, neutralized before it could be exploited again. Natasha saw the danger immediately, recognizing the same logic that had shaped her own past. Fear turned into justification, justification into atrocity. But Tony brushed her off with a brittle smile, claiming this was different, that this time the threat was real, ancient, unbeatable by heroics alone. Across the world, the effects multiplied, sleep disorders skyrocketing, governments enforcing curfews not for crime but for rest, doctors prescribing sedation in dangerous amounts, entire cities dimming lights in superstitious desperation. And through it all, Pennywise moved unseen, feeding not just on terror, but on the measures taken to avoid it because repression tasted just as sweet. Thor attempted to rally morale standing before civilians as a symbol of strength, yet felt his voice falter when a child asked if gods dreamed of dying. And for the first time, Thor could not lie convincingly. Pennywise's influence threading through belief systems older than science. Bruce attempted meditation, isolation, anything to calm Hulk, but fear is not soothed by silence. It echoes, and Banner began to realize Pennywise had not attacked Hulk directly because Hulk represented something purer than rage, innocence corrupted by trauma, and that made him dangerous prey. Wanda withdrew entirely, sealing herself in layers of magic, yet Pennywise still slipped through, appearing in reflections, in memories she had not yet lived, hinting at futures where her grief drowned worlds, and she began to fear not Pennywise's presence, but her own potential under its influence. Dr. Strange finally uncovered fragments of truth buried in forbidden grimoires, learning that Pennywise was not bound to a single form or realm, that it was an interdimensional predator sustained by cyclical fear, weakened only when prey truly believed it could be defeated, not symbolically, but collectively. And Strange realized with chilling clarity that skepticism was not enough. Belief had to be restored faster than fear spread. Tony's final mistake of the segment came quietly, without debate or announcement, as he activated an experimental global broadcast system designed to warn the world, to tell them the truth about Pennywise, believing knowledge would immunize humanity. But Pennywise loved stories, especially frightening ones, and within minutes the broadcast dissolved into hysteria, markets crashed, riots erupted, faith systems fractured, and fear spiked beyond anything Pennywise had tasted before. High above the chaos, Pennywise stood unseen, grinning wider than physics should allow, applauding Tony's ingenuity, because the greatest minds always built the grandest feeding grounds, and as the laughter echoed faintly across dimensions, Dr. Strange felt the shift, the universe tipping into a deeper phase of the nightmare. Segment 1 ended not with destruction but with surrender, not to Pennywise itself, but to the idea that fear was inevitable, and that belief would haunt the Marvel universe far longer than any clown ever could. Escalation did not arrive with warning sirens or celestial invasions, but with absence, because heroes began failing to wake up, not dead, not injured, simply unreachable, trapped in a state where bodies breathed, yet minds were missing, and that terrified the Avengers more than any battlefield loss ever had. The first was a low-profile telepath in Eastern Europe, found unresponsive, with a smile stretched too wide across his face. Brain activity spiking whenever REM sleep deepened, doctors unable to pull him out no matter how violently they intervened, and Dr. Strange felt the signature immediately, a psychic hook embedded deep into the dreamscape, barbed, deliberate hunting. Pennywise had changed tactics. No longer content to whisper and watch, it was selecting targets with intent, drawing them into curated nightmares where fear was not chaos but architecture, rooms built to collapse precisely when hope peaked, and each trapped mind strengthened the entity's hold on this universe. Strange gathered those still standing and spoke without ceremony, explaining that Pennywise was now a dream hunter, an apex predator, operating where they were weakest, that traditional defense meant nothing because the battlefield was unconsciousness itself, and the only way to retrieve the lost was to follow, willingly, to step into the place Pennywise ruled absolutely. Tony objected immediately, not out of fear, but control, arguing that entering the dream space blindly was suicide, proposing machines interface as safeguards, but his voice lacked conviction, his confidence still fractured, and Pennywise sensed it instantly, laughter echoing faintly through the room, though no one could locate the source. Wanda surprised them all by agreeing with Strange, her voice calm but hollow, admitting she could already feel the dream realm bleeding into reality, that sleep was becoming a shared ocean rather than an individual experience. And if they waited too long, there would be no border left to cross. The plan was reckless by any rational metric. Strange would anchor a gateway through the astral plane while Wanda stabilized emotional resonance, allowing selected Avengers to project their consciousness into the nightmare while their bodies remained guarded. A rescue mission inside fear itself. Knowing full well that Pennywise would be waiting, Bruce volunteered before anyone could stop him, not because he was brave, but because Hulk was terrified. And Banner understood that if fear was the language Pennywise spoke, then Hulk's silence was an unanswered call that would only grow louder. Spider-Man followed, shaking but determined, guilt driving him harder than courage ever could, and Natasha stepped forward without comment, trained her whole life to operate in the dark spaces others avoided, even when those spaces were internal. As the ritual began, the world seemed to tilt. Gravity loosening its grip, colors bleeding into each other, and sleep overtook them not gently, but like a hand closing around the throat, pulling them under. They woke, standing on a carnival midway stretching infinitely in both directions, lights flickering erratically, the air thick with the smell of rust and sugar, laughter layered upon laughter echoing from behind every attraction, and towering above it all, a sign reading, "Welcome Home," in dripping red paint. Pennywise appeared slowly, clapping enthusiastically, congratulating them for finally accepting the invitation, explaining that most prey never chose to enter the maze. That choice alone made them special, and therefore more delicious. Natasha moved first, tactical even here, scanning for exits, only to watch pathways rearrange themselves mockingly, the dream obeying Pennywise's whim, not logic, not physics. And she realized with cold clarity that training meant nothing, where reality itself was hostile. Bruce felt Hulk stirring violently, not with rage but panic, the ground beneath him softening into something fleshy, voices whispering that Hulk was small, that Banner was the real monster, that neither deserved to wake up, and Banner struggled to maintain cohesion as Pennywise leaned close, murmuring that fear was not weakness. It was truth surfacing. Spider-Man tried humor and failed, his jokes dissolving into echoes that returned twisted, mocking, reminding him of every scream he'd arrived too late to stop, every body he'd zipped into a web shroud, and Pennywise delighted in the way responsibility weighed heavier than any physical chain. Strange attempted a counterspell and watched it unravel mid-gesture, symbols rotting into nonsense, Pennywise explaining cheerfully that this realm ran on belief, not knowledge, and that Strange's doubt since the broadcast disaster had weakened him far more than he realized. Then Pennywise changed the game, snapping its fingers, the carnival lights going out simultaneously, darkness swallowing everything except a single spotlight illuminating a row of doors, each marked with the name of a trapped hero. And Pennywise explained the rules with theatrical glee, one door at a time, one fear at a time. Choose wrong, and someone stays forever. The Avengers exchanged glances, heavy with understanding. This was no rescue mission anymore. It was a hunt designed to force sacrifice. And Pennywise stepped back, bowing deeply, because the chase was always more entertaining when the prey believed they still had choices. Pennywise quote. Grin widened as the Avengers stepped toward the doors, each name flickering in cruel neon light above the frames, the air thick with anticipation, and the carnival midway seemed to stretch endlessly, as if mocking the very concept of direction, making them question whether movement meant progress or deeper entrapment. Spider-Man hesitated, his instinct screaming that this was more than a puzzle, more than a test. But responsibility drove him forward, forcing him to touch the handle of the first door, the metal cold as ice, despite the oppressive warmth of the dream. And as he opened it, the world inside shifted violently into a distorted recreation of Queens. But nothing familiar remained, the streets bleeding into each other, residents twisted in impossible angles, eyes empty and staring, whispering truths Spider-Man had never wanted to hear about his own failures, the ones that haunted him when sleep finally surrendered him. Natasha followed, her tactical mind racing, noting how the space itself reacted to their thoughts. That fear was now literal physics. Warping walls, stairs, even gravity, according to what Pennywise perceived they feared most. Her door opening into a high-rise she had infiltrated years ago. But all faces of the agents she knew were replaced with distorted masks, grinning, accusing her of every life taken in cold calculation. And she felt an itch of panic as her own heartbeat echoed unnaturally, unnervingly loud, proving Pennywise's point that the strongest minds were also the most fragile when confronted with self-doubt. Bruce froze at his door, staring at a recreation of his lab, only it was broken, suspended in mid-air, test tubes dripping black fluid into nothingness. Hulk's shadow cast larger than he could control, every movement multiplying fear rather than dispersing it, and Pennywise's laughter sounded as if it were coming from inside his own skull, whispering that anger would not save him here, that suppression would not save him, that surrender was optional but inevitable. Thor's door revealed a throne room of Asgard, where the warriors knelt, frozen in fear, the bifrost broken, rivers of molten gold stretching toward a void, and above it floated a massive balloon shaped like Odin's face, grinning cruelly, as if to announce that even the All-Father could be mocked, the dream bending, as Pennywise explained that gods were simply prey with better armor, and that even divine pride was edible. Doctor Strange stepped cautiously, senses extended, ready to stabilize the group, yet even he faltered when opening his door to a vast library where books screamed aloud, secrets he had buried, memories of failure, moments where magic had betrayed him, knowledge leaking like ink into the void, and he realized the truth. Pennywise was no mere manipulator. It was a curator of nightmares, an architect of terror whose skill exceeded mortal comprehension. Pennywise appeared intermittently, sometimes towering, sometimes miniature, whispering instructions, sometimes mocking them for hesitation. And each appearance reinforced a fundamental rule. The more they doubted themselves or each other, the more the realm twisted in its favor, turning allies into obstacles, confidence into hallucination, courage into illusion, and the Avengers understood, with a sinking certainty, that fear was now not just personal, but contagious. Spider-Man, paralyzed for a heartbeat too long, saw Natasha's reflection in a puddle that should not have existed, but it moved independently, mocking his own inability to protect, whispering that she might already be lost, and the realization that every choice could trigger a permanent nightmare clawed into his chest, making each step feel heavier, each decision more lethal. Bruce attempted to calm Hulk, whispering logic that failed him entirely, and as Hulk's panic rose, Pennywise manifested physically beside him, claws glinting, offering a single proposition: embrace the fear completely, or it would be weaponized against everyone else. Hulk's roar shattered the space momentarily, but the roar itself echoed back warped, turning anger into terror, proving Pennywise had learned the rhythm of even monstrous minds. Thor, for the first time, felt hesitation as well, the All-Father's balloon looming directly above him, laughter echoing through his chest, reminding him that strength was irrelevant if one could not protect those who trusted it. And for a brief second, Thor questioned whether heroism itself was merely a construct Pennywise had designed to amplify fear. Doctor Strange acted decisively, attempting to tether everyone to his own mental anchor. But each link pulled against the dream's architecture, Pennywise's influence flexing in unpredictable ways, proving that control was an illusion, that even knowledge became weaponized when twisted through fear. And as each Avenger struggled against their personal nightmare, one misstep by Spider-Man caused the door behind Natasha to vanish, trapping her momentarily in a shifting corridor of screaming masks. Pennywise appeared fully for the first time, arms spread theatrically, announcing with perfect clarity that the first casualty of indecision had occurred, not by death, but by psychological collapse, and that the pattern was irreversible. Hesitation, mistrust, and fear multiplied within this dream, and the consequences would echo in reality, perhaps forever. The segment ends with the Avengers realizing, in unison and horror, that the Dream Hunter was no longer merely playful or selective. It was systematically dismantling them, studying their weaknesses, and preparing to claim not just their minds, but the fragile stability of the Marvel Universe itself. Pennywise, quote, as presence intensified as the Avengers pressed forward, every step measured against an invisible metronome of fear, because Hesitation was no longer merely inconvenient, it was deadly, and the carnival around them began to pulse like a living organism, twisting corridors and spinning lights to punish indecision. The first impossible choice presented itself when Spider-Man reached the center of a distorted playground, swings swaying without wind, slides dripping with shadows, and a single red balloon hovered at eye level, emblazoned with the name of a missing hero. Vision. Pennywise's voice echoed clearly, sweet and cruel, offering a choice. Save Vision by remaining behind alone or risk stepping forward and potentially losing someone else forever. Peter froze, the moral calculus grinding inside his mind because every option felt like betrayal. And as the balloon floated mockingly toward him, memories of Uncle Ben, Gwen, and every child he had failed flooded in, twisted by Pennywise into a single unbearable truth. Fear was responsibility, and failure was inevitable. Meanwhile, Wanda's corridor distorted around her, mirrors appearing on every wall, reflecting her worst fears. Sokovia reduced to ash, Vision screaming silently, her own powers turning against her in exaggerated, grotesque forms. And Pennywise appeared before her, smiling politely, asking if she would give in or risk everyone she loved. Her hesitation mirrored by a shifting landscape that threatened to collapse at any misstep. Bruce, Hulk contained momentarily but terror growing, encountered an endless staircase descending into darkness where every step echoed with whispers of failure, children's cries, and his own monstrous guilt. Pennywise leaned in close, claws barely touching, and suggested that strength meant nothing when fear outweighed courage, offering Bruce a paradox. Embrace the fear fully and escape, or resist and be consumed. But the consumption extended beyond him into the minds of his friends. Thor's path twisted into a battlefield frozen in time, Asgardian warriors trapped in poses of agony, Odin's throne reduced to shards of gold, and a massive balloon shaped like his father's head floated above, eyes gleaming with malevolent amusement. Pennywise taunted, telling Thor that a god could die inside his own mind, that pride and responsibility were chains, and that failure here meant a permanent removal from the universe's narrative. Doctor Strange's anchoring attempts began to fail, the astral plane tethering fraying as he struggled to maintain cohesion among the heroes, and he realized the lesson Pennywise was teaching was brutal. Fear was a predator, and logic or magic could not protect those unwilling to confront their deepest vulnerabilities simultaneously. Spider-Man made the first decision under unbearable weight, stepping forward, reaching for the balloon, and for a heartbeat, it seemed the choice was correct. The red balloon collapsing harmlessly, Vision's name fading into light. But Pennywise laughed, the carnival bending violently, and the floor beneath Peter's feet vanished, separating him from the others, signaling that even the right choice could be manipulated, that hesitation and guilt were equally exploitable. Natasha acted with precision, moving through a hallway lined with doors, each door a fragment of her past operations, successes, and failures, presented as scenarios where any choice she made would result in someone else's torment. Pennywise appeared, a small figure perched atop a floating carousel, reminding her that leadership was a trap, and she realized with cold clarity that fear had redefined victory, making moral integrity itself a weapon Pennywise wielded effortlessly. Bruce finally made a decision, choosing to embrace the fear, allowing himself to sink fully into the nightmare rather than resist. And for a moment, the landscape stilled. The whispers softened. Yet Pennywise only tilted its head and clapped softly, explaining that surrender was never simple, that heroes' fear was more delectable when they believed they had exercised choice. And Hulk's relief was short-lived, because even submission carried consequences. Thor, struggling with the impossible weight of responsibility, realized that even divine power could not immunize him from manipulation, and that Pennywise's architecture of fear was teaching them something more sinister than death: inevitability. The understanding that the universe could twist perception until the strongest minds folded from within. Dr. Strange, watching each Avenger struggle with the Predator's design, realized that knowledge alone could not free them. Only understanding and confrontation of their own hidden guilt, their unspoken weaknesses, could counter the Dream Hunter, and yet even he admitted silently that time was slipping away, and every second delayed allowed Pennywise to consolidate power. The segment ends with Spider-Man trapped in an isolated nightmare, Peter screaming inside a looping alleyway where shadows mocked him endlessly, Natasha barely holding her composure, Bruce barely in control, Wanda forced to confront illusions of complete failure, Thor doubting the nature of heroism itself, and Pennywise standing in the center of it all, smiling wider than physics allowed, applauding the systematic unraveling of the Avengers' courage, and leaving the audience with the terrifying certainty that the Dream Hunter would not be stopped by conventional means. Time fractured inside the nightmare, measured not by clocks, but by escalating terror, because Pennywise had learned to manipulate perception, making minutes feel like hours, and hours stretch into lifetimes. And the Avengers felt every second press against them like gravity inverted, like sleep itself had become a weapon. Spider-Man's isolation worsened, the looping alley stretching into infinity, shadows whispering every guilt, every failure, and despite his cleverness, he realized that even web-slinging was meaningless here. Every escape route dissolved as if the dream recognized hope as a weakness, and Pennywise's voice came softly, intimately, telling him he could stay trapped forever if he believed the nightmare was unbreakable. Natasha moved desperately through a corridor of mirrors, each reflecting potential deaths of her teammates, each step a calculation of impossibility. And when she reached the center of the hallway, Pennywise appeared, arms spread theatrically, asking with mock politeness which she would sacrifice. And Natasha understood that hesitation was more lethal than any weapon she had ever faced, that fear itself had become the battlefield. Bruce, fully submerged now, felt Hulk shrink into Banner, terror squeezing muscle and bone, the floor of his nightmare dissolving into a liquid of screaming children, of past victims, and of monsters he could not control. Pennywise crouched close, whispering that anger would not save anyone, that control was a delusion, that submission was a feast. And Banner realized with a sickening clarity that surrendering here was not weakness, but necessity. Wanda's illusions multiplied, the walls of her dream folding into impossible shapes, vision dying repeatedly in ways that contradicted physics, reality bending to Pennywise's whim, and she understood that the clown had transcended fear itself, manipulating both mind and environment to turn even hope into terror, leaving her powerless to anchor herself or anyone else. Thor's trial had escalated to cruelty beyond words. The battlefield of Asgard shattered into jagged spires floating above an abyss. The balloon Odin mocking every decision he considered, and Pennywise told him plainly that heroism was now irrelevant, that even divine power could be devoured by the proper arrangement of doubt, despair, and guilt. And Thor's hammer felt heavier than ever, not from weight, but from the burden of impossibility. Doctor Strange tried desperately to tether them together with magic, extending his consciousness to reach every mind. But Pennywise anticipated each gesture, warping the spell mid-incantation, using their own attempts at control as bait, turning hope into manipulation. And Strange realized that the entity was not simply a predator. It was a teacher, instructing them in terror, demonstrating how fragile the mind could be when fear ruled unopposed. Then it happened. Spider-Man, caught in his infinite alley, made a choice, one that felt morally correct, one he hoped would save Vision, only to discover that the choice itself was a trap. The alley contracted, shadows solidifying into clawed hands, the walls bending inward, and Peter screamed as the floor beneath him vanished, dropping him into a void of perpetual uncertainty, the nightmare claiming him permanently. Pennywise laughed not out of cruelty alone, but delight in the precision of the hunt. And for the first time the Avengers realized a hero could be lost without ever leaving a mark on reality. Natasha, witnessing Spider-Man vanish, fought through panic and grief, finally forcing herself to act decisively, slamming doors open to reach the others, and in doing so disrupted Pennywise's choreography just enough to pull Bruce and Wanda toward temporary stability, though the carnival still twisted violently around them, reminding them the predator was patient, the predator was meticulous, and no one was truly safe. Thor struck out in fury, shattering illusions of Asgard with mighty blows, yet the balloons and spires reformed instantly, mocking, and Pennywise's presence became almost corporeal, looming over them, not to attack, but to remind them that escape here required understanding, not force, that only confronting fear honestly could shift the tides, and even gods could tremble. Doctor Strange, analyzing the pattern, finally whispered the cruel truth. The more they struggled to control, to rationalize, to plan, the stronger Pennywise became, feeding on fear that had not been faced but resisted, teaching them that the universe's first predator was patience, cunning, and knowledge of your deepest vulnerabilities. The segment ended with a mixture of relief and devastation. Spider-Man lost, Bruce stabilizing but shaken to his core, Wanda barely keeping reality anchored, Natasha hardened by experience, Thor questioning the very essence of heroism, Strange aware that this was only the beginning, and Pennywise stepping back into the shadows, satisfied, whispering that the hunt would continue, that fear would always find a way, and that the dream hunter had only just begun teaching the universe how fragile even the mightiest minds truly were. Reality began to quiver at the edges, not with earthquakes or cosmic storms, but with subtle distortions that whispered of something far older than the Avengers, something that did not obey physics, morality, or even consciousness itself, because Pennywise had grown beyond predator into architect, feeding not merely on fear, but on the very structure of the universe, reshaping it like clay in anticipation of collapse. The first visible signs were small but unnerving. Buildings bending impossibly at corners, streetlights melting upward like wax, shadows moving independent of their owners, and in the sky, a storm of red and white swirling into the familiar grin of the clown that haunted dreams. And Dr. Strange sensed that whatever had begun in nightmares was now spilling into waking reality. New York became a laboratory of terror. Civilians unaware that every panic, every scream, every irrational decision strengthened Pennywise, reinforcing the invisible scaffolding that allowed him to manifest more fully. And across the city, the Avengers struggled to coordinate, the weight of previous failures pressing heavily on them, because this predator had evolved from hunter to god, omnipresent in perception and impossible to fight conventionally. Thor wielded Stormbreaker through streets that bent in impossible angles, yet every strike against what should have been physical obstacles passed harmlessly through, walls and vehicles dissolving before his eyes, and from the corner of every vision, Pennywise appeared, towering, miniature, shifting, demonstrating mastery over the very laws of existence, laughing with perfect timing, teaching them that resistance was theater and despair the real stage. Spider-Man's absence was a constant phantom, echoing in their minds, a visceral reminder of what they faced, fear that could consume without killing, that could erase presence and memory simultaneously, and Pennywise's laughter threaded through reality, twisting wires, reflections, even radio signals, embedding terror, as if the universe itself had learned to speak in his voice. Bruce and Wanda operated together, attempting to stabilize pockets of reality using a combination of Banner's science and Wanda's chaos magic. Yet every attempt was preempted by the subtle reshaping of space around them. A door opening into nothingness, a ceiling dropping into a red abyss, a child's voice whispering warnings that made Hulk's muscles spasm and Wanda's control fracture, proving Pennywise's intelligence was not merely reactive, it was anticipatory. Doctor Strange, holding the sanctity of the city with desperate precision, realized the rules had changed. This was no longer a battle in which death or injury defined stakes, but a war over perception itself, where panic multiplied exponentially, where hope became volatile, and where a single misstep could cost an entire neighborhood their grasp on reality, a lesson Pennywise delivered daily with subtlety and cruelty. Natasha moved through twisted streets like a shadow herself, every encounter reminding her that this nightmare had no combat logic, only psychological logic, and even her impeccable training could not counter the fact that fear was now physical, that hesitation alone could make walls bend, floors disappear, allies vanish, and that Pennywise's presence amplified everything humans and gods feared most about themselves. Pennywise finally emerged fully, no longer small, no longer crouched, but towering over the skyline as if sculpted from the fears of every mind simultaneously, claws lengthened impossibly, eyes glowing like twin moons of terror, grin wider than physics allowed, floating above the Avengers as though the very air were his stage, and the city around them whispered in the voices of their dead and missing, reinforcing the lesson that nothing in this universe was beyond his reach. Spider-Man's absence haunted every step. Tony Stark's obsession with control now dangerously bordering mania. Thor questioning divinity. Wanda teetering between hope and collapse. Bruce barely containing Hulk. Natasha remaining the only pillar of clarity, and Strange realizing that the only way to confront this new god of nightmares was to understand the pattern, to recognize the feeding mechanisms, to manipulate the predator into overconfidence, and perhaps to make a counterplay that no hero had attempted before. And yet, even as they planned, Pennywise laughed, the sound echoing through collapsed streets, distorted skies, bending buildings, the laughter a reminder that gods, heroes, and monsters alike were all prey in a game that had only begun, that the Marvel Universe itself was now the hunting ground of a nightmare whose appetite grew with every heartbeat, every scream, every suppressed doubt. And the Avengers understood with chilling clarity that the war ahead would demand sacrifices not just of courage, but of mind, soul, and perhaps reality itself. The city's skyline collapsed physically, but perceptually, buildings stretching, folding, and twisting into impossible angles, sidewalks pouring into the air and street lamps dangling like pendulums, and every citizen unconsciously contributed to the distortion, their fear forming a lattice that Pennywise rode like a symphony, orchestrating chaos with precision beyond comprehension. Spider-Man's absence resonated like a phantom pain, his memory haunting every Avenger as they navigated streets that were not streets, alleys that became chasms, and doors opening onto infinite voids where walls whispered secrets about their failures, their doubts, their private fears, all arranged by Pennywise with meticulous cruelty to make survival not a question of strength, but of psychological endurance. Thor charged forward through a street that became a river of molten gold, Stormbreaker striking at phantom enemies, only to have the hammer pass through nothing repeatedly, and from above, the massive grin of Pennywise shimmered like a specter, voice echoing directly into Thor's mind, reminding him that even gods could not crush illusions, that divine power was meaningless against mastery over perception, and every swing of the hammer reminded him that he was playing a game defined entirely by terror. Wanda's magic faltered as the world around her obeyed Pennywise rather than natural law, every spell warping into something grotesque, every attempt to anchor reality reinforcing the predator's dominion, and she realized with sinking dread that the creature had learned to feed not on ordinary fear, but on the paradoxical fear of failing while trying to save others, a psychological calculus so precise it rendered even the strongest magical defenses fragile. Bruce, Hulk suppressed, but panic mounting, faced entire streets made of screaming children, echoes of Sokovia, and ghosts of people he had failed to save, the air thick with sensory overload, and Pennywise emerged before him, voice soft but lethal, telling him that monsters could not be contained, that anger was a shield only if one truly embraced the fear behind it, and that the Hulk would never be free until Banner surrendered fully to the nightmare. Dr. Strange attempted to stabilize the environment, bending fragments of collapsing physics into temporary wards, but Pennywise anticipated each motion, warping dimensions mid-cast, turning thought into failure, intention into terror, and Strange understood that the predator had evolved beyond hunting prey. It was rewriting reality itself to ensure fear became inevitable and omnipresent. Natasha moved through streets that mirrored her worst missions, each corner revealing a potential disaster she could have prevented, each shadow whispering accusations she could neither deny nor escape. And when she reached a ruined shield helicarrier, she realized that even familiar territory was now weaponized. The predator's intelligence, not merely reactive, but anticipatory, feeding on human guilt and moral perfection to drive heroes toward collapse. Tony Stark's obsession had mutated into desperation, overlaying city grids with predictive algorithms and defense networks, but Pennywise manipulated perception so that each calculation became contradictory, every interface twisted into mockery, and Stark realized that knowledge and technology were meaningless, where belief was the only true anchor, leaving him vulnerable, unsteady, and dangerously overconfident. Spider-Man's memory resurfaced like a ghost in every corridor, his screams embedded in the nightmare, echoing directly into the Avengers' consciousness, and the team felt the cost of underestimating the Predator. One misstep could permanently erase not just a life, but the sense of reality itself, and Pennywise's omnipresence reminded them that even a momentary lapse could fracture entire minds. Pennywise finally made a display of omnipotence, merging street, sky, and dreamscape into a singular vision of horror, where heroes could not tell if time moved forward, backward, or not at all. And as he descended into the center of this twisted city, he extended claws toward them, voice resonating like a cathedral of screams, explaining that the ultimate lesson of fear was inevitability, that resistance itself was delicious because it delayed surrender, and that even gods and heroes were prey in a universe he now controlled in perception and mind. The segment ended with the Avengers battered mentally and spiritually, each struggling against illusions that could break them permanently, each understanding for the first time the scale of the threat, and Pennywise receding into the red and white storm above, leaving them to navigate a city that no longer obeyed the rules of reality, a world on the verge of collapse, and the chilling realization that this god of nightmares had only begun to demonstrate what a universe fully conquered by fear could look like. The city trembled not from force, but from perception, as the Avengers pushed forward, each step a struggle against reality itself, bending to Pennywise's whim, because he no longer merely haunted dreams, he commanded them, reshaping streets, buildings, and even air into instruments of fear, a symphony where courage was drowned before it could rise. Spider-Man's absence weighed heavily, the void of his loss infecting every decision, each of them haunted by the memory of his screams embedded in their minds, echoing through the twisted streets as though the city itself had become his voice. And the team realized with sinking dread that Pennywise now weaponized absence, grief, and memory as efficiently as any physical attack. Thor charged down a street that flowed upward into the sky, Stormbreaker in hand, each swing smashing illusions that reformed instantly, and Pennywise appeared above, towering monstrously, a grin splitting his face impossibly wide, eyes gleaming with malevolent intelligence, whispering that divine power alone could not free them, that gods were prey too, and every strike Thor made reinforced the Predator's dominance. Wanda's magic rippled through the collapsing dreamscape, every spell warping unpredictably, reflections multiplying into infinite false threats, and she realized that the clown had calculated her every fear, using it to amplify panic in ways that no hero's logic or instinct could counter, and that the only escape required confronting truths she had long buried about power, loss, and responsibility. Bruce faced streets flowing with screaming shadows, his control over Hulk slipping with every heartbeat. Pennywise crouched beside him, murmuring that monsters feared themselves first, and every attempt to stabilize his mind only fed the entity's strength, proving that fear had a language of its own, and Hulk's rage was only part of the equation. Natasha navigated hallways lined with mirrors, showing her past missions in grotesque exaggeration, allies dead before she could act. Every misstep made literal, every hesitation a trap. And when Pennywise appeared smiling politely on a floating carousel, she understood that the predator had mastered psychological architecture, turning her impeccable tactical mind into a playground of terror. Dr. Strange attempted a desperate maneuver, tethering his consciousness across the group, threading stability through magic, only for Pennywise to exploit it, warping the tether into chains of hallucination, turning coordination into confusion. And Strange realized that the only way to survive was not merely to act, but to anticipate, outthink, and confront fear on its own terms, a challenge of intellect and will unlike any before. Then came the first major sacrifice. Spider-Man's absence had created a vulnerability that Pennywise exploited perfectly, manifesting illusions that trapped Wanda in a looping nightmare of vision dying endlessly, no matter what she did, forcing her to make a decision she could not bear, abandon the simulation and save the rest of the team, or remain and risk psychological collapse permanently. Wanda chose the team, collapsing out of her personal nightmare and leaving the illusory vision looping eternally, a psychic scream echoing in her mind. And the lesson was brutal. Even heroes could not save everyone, and fear had transformed decision into weapon, grief into armor for the predator, and moral certainty into chains. Thor, watching, realized that even divine intervention could not prevent loss here, that sacrifice was no longer optional, and that Pennywise's playground of nightmares had become a crucible where every action was both survival and moral test, a terrifying calculus he could barely comprehend. Bruce finally accepted the impossibility of complete control, allowing Hulk's panic to coexist with Banner's mind, stabilizing enough to move, but at the cost of internal torment that would echo far beyond the dreamscape. And Pennywise observed patiently, grinning wider, feeding on the delicate balance between despair and determination. Dr. Strange noted the pattern, a glimmer of strategy emerging. Pennywise's power, though immense, relied on their fear and hesitation, and if they could act decisively together, confronting both their own weaknesses and the predator's design, there might be a way to push back, though the cost would be unimaginable, and each hero understood the reality of the stakes. They were fighting a god of nightmares, and nightmares did not obey conventional rules. The segment closed with the Avengers battered, traumatized, but still moving, Pennywise looming above the distorted city like an omnipotent judge, the weight of their losses pressing down, and the terrible truth settling in. This was no longer merely survival, it was a war over reality itself. And the god of nightmares had already begun exacting a toll that could never be repaid. The city itself screamed, streets bending, sky was melting into rivers of impossible light, shadows twisting into sentient forms, and the Avengers realized fully that Pennywise was no longer a predator within dreams. He was a god of nightmares whose influence had begun to reshape reality itself, and every heartbeat amplified the distortion. Spider-Man's absence remained a ghost, haunting every decision, every corridor they traversed, and his loss became a symbol of the stakes. Failure could erase not just life, but the very sense of existence. Tony Stark's attempts to calculate, to overlay predictive systems failed against rules that did not obey logic, while Thor swung Stormbreaker at phantom armies that vanished mid-strike, the air itself warped by the Predator's control. Wanda's magic strained under the pressure of folding reality, every spell rebounding unpredictably, every attempt to anchor fragments of the city causing new distortions elsewhere, and the illusions of vision dying over and over in her mind reminded her that even immense power could not prevent personal loss, that fear could weaponize love, hope, and grief simultaneously. Bruce struggled to maintain Hulk's control, the streets morphing into nightmares of past trauma, every scream feeding Pennywise's omnipresent power, teaching the cruel lesson that monsters were prey too, that rage could be twisted into terror, and even Banner's intellect could only temporarily stabilize the tidal wave of horror. Natasha moved with deadly precision, navigating corridors that defied geometry, avoiding illusions that sought to trap her mind permanently, and every calculated step reminded her that Pennywise's intelligence was not merely reactive. It was anticipatory, understanding strategy and emotion simultaneously, predicting human morality and exploiting it to the fullest. Dr. Strange extended his consciousness across the team, desperately attempting to stabilize the collapsing city. But even the astral plane seemed infiltrated, rules warped by fear. And he realized the Predator's final lesson. Belief fueled power, hesitation fueled control, and the Avengers trapped between their responsibility and their terror, with no middle ground. Pennywise finally revealed his full form above the cityscape, towering impossibly high, eyes gleaming, claws extended, grinning wider than the universe allowed, speaking directly into the minds of the Avengers, mocking every doubt, every hesitation, every moral calculus, and showing glimpses of reality entirely consumed by fear. A universe where heroism was meaningless, hope an illusion, and despair absolute. Tony, desperate, attempted one final gambit, a broadcast to warn the world, hoping that collective awareness could destabilize the Predator's influence, only for Pennywise to twist the signal, amplifying terror instead of calming it, turning technology into a vector of fear. And Stark realized with sickening clarity that conventional methods were entirely impotent here. Thor, witnessing the devastation, understood that strength alone could not intervene, that divine power could not impose order on chaos where fear dictated physics, and that every swing of Stormbreaker now risked further unraveling reality. Yet still he charged, driven by instinct and responsibility, a god constrained by human limits in a world unmade. The segment climaxed when Pennywise extended his reach, warping the entire city into a spiraling nightmare vortex. Buildings, streets, and sky folding into a single impossible architecture, every Avenger experiencing personal terror simultaneously. Spider-Man's screams echoing in the mental backdrop as a reminder of loss, and Wanda realizing that the final confrontation would demand confronting not only Pennywise, but the deepest, darkest truths they each hid from themselves. The segment ended with the Avengers battered, teetering between survival and collapse, Pennywise looming as a god over a city that no longer obeyed rules, and the unspoken understanding that the final battle, the confrontation where fear itself would be tested, was approaching, and the Marvel Universe hung by a thread in a nightmare that had become terrifyingly real. The Avengers stood on the precipice of reality, the city twisted beyond recognition, streets spiraling into infinite loops, buildings collapsing sideways into the sky, and every heartbeat amplified the sensation that the world itself had become a nightmare, because Pennywise had fully claimed perception, making the boundary between dream and reality meaningless. Spider-Man's absence was a constant shadow, a reminder of the cost of hesitation, his screams echoing in residual memory like a phantom tether, pushing each hero to confront fear not just externally, but internally. Tony Stark's mind raced, not with calculations, but with guilt, realizing that every failed prediction, every misstep, had fed the predator, and that the only path forward was to risk everything in a gambit that defied both science and sanity. Wanda's magic bent unpredictably around her, reflecting the instability of the dreamscape, the repeated deaths of visions still replaying in her mind, and she understood that to succeed she would have to manipulate fear as Pennywise did, turning grief into strategy, despair into a weapon, an insight that terrified her as much as the reality around them. Bruce and Hulk stood together, Hulk's raw power tempered by Banner's intellect, realizing that the psychological architecture Pennywise had built was feeding on hesitation and doubt, and only by embracing fear fully and consciously could they begin to reclaim control over even fragments of reality, a dangerous balance between surrender and resistance. Thor lifted Stormbreaker, the weapon seeming almost weightless against the warped skies, his godly strength pitted against chaos. And yet he felt a flicker of doubt, the first true admission that even a god could be unmade in perception, that heroism alone could not counter the architect of nightmares, and that instinct had to be complemented by insight. Dr. Strange extended his consciousness, threading connections across the team, weaving strands of magic and focus into fragile anchors within the storm, understanding that Pennywise thrived on fear, multiplied in belief fractured, and that the battle would not be fought solely with might or spells, but with the courage to confront truths buried in the deepest recesses of mind and soul. Pennywise appeared, towering impossibly above them, claws extended, eyes glinting with omniscient cruelty, grin wider than the universe permitted, and he spoke directly into their consciousness, voice layering itself in every possible inflection, offering visions of endless failure, promises of despair, temptations to surrender permanently, a test designed to destroy hope itself. The first tactical move came from Wanda, focusing magic not on offense but on projection, creating illusions of hope, fragments of stability, small victories that were psychological rather than physical. And for a heartbeat, the Avengers felt the first sense of control in weeks, though fleeting, because Pennywise responded immediately, warping each victory into a challenge, each success into a new fear, reinforcing the Predator's dominion over perception. Thor swung Stormbreaker through multiple illusions simultaneously, striking phantasms that dissolved before impact, yet his presence reinforced courage among the team. Hulk roared in tandem, Bruce guiding the fury with strategy, and Natasha moved like shadow and precision, striking at instability points, teaching them that coordinated action, belief synchronized with action, was the only tool strong enough to challenge a god of nightmares. Doctor Strange attempted a high-risk spell, threading reality across multiple dimensions to force Pennywise into a single locus, but the Predator anticipated warping probability itself to counter the move, yet in doing so revealed a pattern. His omnipotence was vast, but not infinite, dependent on fear being unopposed, and Strange whispered to the team that understanding the pattern, exploiting the mechanics of terror, was their only hope. The segment closed with Pennywise looming, the Avengers battered but resolute, a universe collapsing around them, illusions and reality intertwined, and the unspoken understanding hung heavy. The last dream war had begun, and every decision, every heartbeat, every conscious embrace of fear would determine whether the Marvel Universe would survive the god of nightmares or be devoured completely. The air vibrated with tension, the city a distorted nightmare of impossible angles and screaming shadows. Yet the Avengers began to move with purpose, their fear sharpened into focus, each heartbeat synchronized, because the only way to fight a god of nightmares was to wield courage as weapon and perception as shield, bending their own fear into strategy. Wanda led the first coordinated strike, weaving threads of chaos magic into illusions of hope, projecting fragments of stability across the battlefield, guiding Hulk through streets of shifting reality. And for a moment, Pennywise's omnipotence wavered, the Predator forced to adapt as the heroes attacked not with force, but with understanding of the very mechanics of terror. Thor swung Stormbreaker in perfect rhythm, striking multiple phantasms simultaneously, the illusionary enemies shattering into bursts of light that anchored small patches of reality, while Tony Stark used predictive algorithms not to dominate, but to anticipate the Predator's manipulations, reinforcing Wanda's magic with technological precision, a fusion of science and sorcery, against a being that thrived on the collapse of both. Bruce channeled Hulk's rage consciously, using it to fuel controlled destruction in areas Pennywise had warped most violently, learning to embrace fear rather than resist it, every step a calculated risk, every swing of massive fists a hammer against the architecture of nightmare, and Pennywise hissed in delight, recognizing the taste of courage now feeding against him instead of into him. Natasha moved through the warped streets with surgical precision, neutralizing psychic traps and illusions with keen observation and timing, exploiting even the smallest inconsistencies in the Predator's design, proving that human ingenuity, when aligned with understanding of fear's mechanics, could carve openings in a god's dominion. Doctor Strange manipulated threads of reality across the collapsing cityscape, weaving connections between hope and action, anchoring areas where fear threatened to consume, and for the first time they saw Pennywise falter, not from power loss, but from overextension, a rare vulnerability in an entity who had grown accustomed to control and exploitation of hesitation. Pennywise, sensing the shift, escalated immediately, warping gravity, bending time, manifesting multiple forms simultaneously, claws striking not just at bodies, but at perception itself. Every illusion designed to exploit personal guilt and past failures. And yet, the Avengers, synchronized, countered, learning to act decisively, trusting instincts, and embracing fear without succumbing to it. The first breakthrough came when Wanda anchored a fragment of reality directly to the team's collective belief. A single street stabilized, Spider-Man's absence momentarily represented as a symbolic presence guiding actions, a psychological anchor that allowed Hulk's fury, Thor's strikes, Natasha's precision, and Stark's technology to function in unison, and Pennywise recoiled slightly, recognizing that this coordinated courage disrupted the Predator's feeding. Thor's swing of Stormbreaker shattered one of Pennywise's largest manifestations, a towering phantasm of red and white swirling above the city, and as it exploded into nothingness, the sound reverberated across the warped landscape, signaling to the heroes that the god of nightmares was not invincible, that decisiveness could fracture his dominion. And for the first time in weeks, they tasted tangible hope. Tony Stark reinforced the strategy by integrating predictive algorithms with Wanda's projections, mapping the Predator's likely manipulations, and creating temporary stabilizing zones, turning fear against itself. And for a fleeting moment, the Avengers felt the first genuine control since the nightmare began, the first proof that coordinated belief and action could challenge a being of near omnipotent terror. The segment closed with Pennywise towering above the partially stabilized city, grinning wider than ever, yet visibly strained, claws twitching in anticipation, and the Avengers standing together, battered but united, realizing that the last dream war had entered a new phase, no longer solely survival, but the beginning of a true counteroffensive, a battle to reclaim not only their minds, but the very reality the Predators sought to consume. Pennywise quotes laughter reverberated through the distorted streets like a chorus of screaming minds, each note twisting reality further. But the Avengers, battered and scarred, advanced with purpose, a synchronized unit transforming fear into weapon, their combined courage acting as both shield and spear against a god who fed on hesitation. Spider-Man's absence haunted them still, but his memory became a motivator, an invisible presence that guided each move, pushing Hulk's controlled fury forward, refining Wanda's projections, and sharpening Natasha's strikes, a psychological anchor, turning grief into resolve, showing that even absence could fuel action when wielded with intent. Thor charged at one of Pennywise's massive forms, striking with Stormbreaker in a rhythm that resonated through the nightmare, the impact sending shockwaves that temporarily stabilized the ground, and for the first time the god of nightmares staggered, its form flickering, demonstrating that even omnipotence could be disrupted by decisiveness combined with unity. Wanda intensified her magic, anchoring multiple areas of the collapsing city with threads of hope, using grief and fear as fuel to shape reality, creating zones of stability that allowed Bruce to use Hulk's strength without the chaos of psychic manipulation, and Natasha to navigate corridors of illusions with lethal precision, the Predator's control faltering against coordinated mastery. Doctor Strange extended his influence across dimensions, weaving reality threads that tethered fragments of the nightmare to stable points, predicting Pennywise's manipulations, exploiting overextensions, and for the first time, the Predator seemed not entirely in control, forced to react instead of dictate, a small but crucial shift in a war fought entirely in perception. Pennywise escalated violently, warping time and space around them, manifesting multiple horrific forms simultaneously, each claw and grin aimed not at bodies, but at consciousness. Every illusion a lethal test, every whispered temptation a potential collapse. And yet the Avengers countered, acting decisively, refusing hesitation, turning fear into leverage against the Predator. The first major casualty occurred when Thor struck a massive illusion, only to find a shard of it anchored in Wanda's mind, and a psychic backlash injured her temporarily, forcing her to collapse into Hulk's protective stance, demonstrating that even coordinated action carried risk, that Pennywise could turn heroism into vulnerability if one faltered even momentarily. Bruce roared, smashing through collapsing streets to reach her, Spider-Man's symbolic presence guiding his movements, Hulk's raw power channeled precisely. And Natasha neutralized psychic traps, while Tony reinforced stabilizing zones with predictive technology, a perfect storm of human and superhuman skill against an entity whose dominion depended entirely on fear and hesitation. Doctor Strange manipulated a temporal anomaly, slowing Pennywise's perceived reactions within the nightmare, creating openings for Thor and Hulk to strike, and the Predator hissed, realizing that the heroes had adapted, that coordinated understanding of fear and reality could fracture even a god's control, and for the first time, its laughter contained a hint of unease. The segment closed with the Avengers battered but operational, Pennywise recoiling into multiple flickering forms, the nightmare city partially stabilized but still unpredictable, and the heroes understanding that the penultimate battle had begun. Casualties had occurred, illusions had been shattered, and the next strike could decide not only the outcome of the war, but the very structure of reality itself. Dot. The sky above the city twisted into a vortex of red and white. The streets below folded into impossible angles, shadows moving independently, and every heartbeat of every living being amplified the Predator's power. But the Avengers advanced, battered, determined, the weight of Spider-Man's absence and prior sacrifices fueling their courage, because the final confrontation demanded more than strength. It demanded unity, clarity, and the willingness to embrace fear fully. Thor swung Stormbreaker with godly precision, the weapon cleaving through illusions, every strike a signal of defiance, while Hulk's controlled fury smashed psychic traps into shards of stabilized reality. And Natasha moved like shadow and precision, neutralizing the Predator's manipulations before they could consolidate, proving that even a god of nightmares could be countered by calculated, fearless action. Wanda's magic rippled outward, threads of hope and grief intertwined, stabilizing entire blocks of the nightmare city, forcing Pennywise to fracture his forms to respond simultaneously, a delicate balancing act that required perfect timing and mental fortitude. And she felt a surge of resolve as her personal grief became a tool instead of a burden. Doctor Strange extended his astral influence, anchoring reality threads across the battlefield, exploiting every crack in Pennywise's architecture, predicting manipulations and turning them back against the Predator, and he realized the paradoxical truth. Only by embracing the Predator's own game, fear turned into action, could they hope to defeat him. Pennywise, towering impossibly, claws extended, eyes gleaming with omniscient cruelty, grin splitting the horizon, unleashed a wave of pure psychic assault, every illusion simultaneously personal, terrifying, and lethal. And for a heartbeat, it seemed the Avengers could be overwhelmed, their minds fracturing under the compounded pressure of hope, fear, and grief. Tony Stark coordinated the team's efforts, synchronizing Wanda's magic, Thor's strikes, Hulk's strength, and Natasha's precision into a single devastatingly coordinated counteroffensive, a rhythm of action and belief exploiting the Predator's overextension, and Spider-Man's memory echoed like a guiding light, pushing them to act with decisiveness they had never needed before. The first massive strike landed when Hulk, guided by Banner's intellect and Wanda's projections, smashed into the largest form Pennywise had manifested, destabilizing the illusion and fracturing the Predator's psychic hold on reality. A shockwave rippling through streets, collapsing several of the twisted nightmare constructs into nothingness, showing that even a god of fear could bleed when confronted with coordinated courage. Thor's Stormbreaker followed, cleaving through another massive manifestation, ripping apart reality-bending structures, while Wanda stabilized zones. Doctor Strange anchored threads, and Natasha struck at psychic weak points. The Avengers acting in perfect synchronization, turning fear and grief into a weapon that forced Pennywise to retract, flicker, and shrink under pressure. The Predator learning that omnipotence could be but challenged when prey no longer hesitated. The final move came as Strange channeled a combined spell, amplified by Wanda, Thor, and Tony, targeting the central locus of Pennywise's influence within the Nightmare City. A concentrated effort to collapse his psychic architecture into a single vulnerable point, and the Predator hissed in rage, claws slashing wildly, eyes blazing with fury, but the Avengers held steady, feeding their courage into the spell until it exploded in a shockwave of reality-stabilizing energy. Pennywise's forms shattered, the Nightmare City slowly unraveling, the red and white storm dissipating, illusions fading, and for the first time, Spider-Man's absence was acknowledged not with despair, but with solemn respect. The Avengers having survived the God of Nightmares by embracing fear, acting decisively, and fighting as one unit. The Marvel Universe trembling but intact, a testament to the power of courage, unity, and the refusal to surrender to terror. The final moment left the Avengers standing amidst the nightmare, battered, scarred, yet victorious, knowing that the Predator had been defeated but not destroyed, that the lessons of fear would linger, that vigilance would always be necessary, and that reality itself was fragile. But even fragile things could endure when courage was applied at the precise moment in unison and without hesitation.